Mr. Coleman Hughes is a columnist for Quillette and has worked as a freelance opinion writer since January 2018. He's had pieces published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, the City Journal, and the Spectator. He's studying philosophy at Columbia University, and we appreciate your attendance, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee. It's an honor to testify on a topic as important as this one. Nothing I'm about to say is meant to minimize the horror and brutality of slavery and Jim Crow. Racism is a bloody stain on this country's history, and I consider our failure to pay reparations directly to freed slaves after the Civil War to be one of the greatest injustices ever perpetrated by the U.S. government. But I worry that our desire to fix the past compromises our ability to fix the present. Think about what we're doing today. We're spending our time debating a bill that mentions slavery 25 times, but incarceration only once, in an era with no black slaves, but nearly 1 million black prisoners. A bill that doesn't mention homicide once, at a time when the Center for Disease Control reports homicide as the #1 cause of death for young black men. I'm not saying that acknowledging history doesn't matter. It does. I'm saying there's a difference between acknowledging history and allowing history to distract us from the problems we face today. In 2008, the House of Representatives formally apologized for slavery and Jim Crow. In 2009, the Senate did the same. Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. We need a less punitive criminal justice system. We need affordable health care. And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. Nearly everyone close to me told me not to testify today. They told me that even though I've only ever voted for Democrats, I'd be perceived as a Republican and therefore hated by half the country. Others told me that by distancing myself from Republicans, I would end up angering the other half of the country. And the sad truth is that they were both right. That's how suspicious we've become of one another. That's how divided we are as a nation. If we were to pay reparations today, we would only divide the country further, making it harder to build the political coalitions required to solve the problems facing black people today. We would insult many black Americans by putting a price on the suffering of their ancestors. And we would turn the relationship between black Americans and white Americans from a coalition into a transaction, from a union between citizens into a lawsuit between plaintiffs and defendants. What we should do is pay reparations to black Americans who actually grew up under Jim Crow and were directly harmed by second-class citizenship, people like my grandparents. But paying reparations to all descendants of slaves is a mistake. Take me, for example. I was born 3 decades after the end of Jim Crow into a privileged household in the suburbs. I attend an Ivy League school. Yet I'm also descended from slaves who worked on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation. So reparations for slavery would allocate federal resources to me, but not to an American with the wrong ancestry, even if that person is living paycheck to paycheck and working multiple jobs to support a family. You might call that justice. I call it justice for the dead at the price of justice for the living. I understand that reparations are about what people are owed, regardless of how well they're doing. I understand that. But the people who are owed for slavery are no longer here, and we're not entitled to collect on their debts. Reparations, by definition, are only given to victims. So the moment you give me reparations, you've made me into a victim without my consent. Not just that, you've made 1/3 of black Americans who poll against reparations into victims without their consent. And black Americans have fought too long for the right to define themselves to be spoken for in such a condescending manner. The question is not what America owes me by virtue of my ancestry. The question is what all Americans owe each other by by virtue of being citizens of the same nation. And the obligation of citizenship is not transactional. It's not contingent on ancestry. It never expires, and it can't be paid off. For all these reasons, Bill H.R. 40 is a moral and political mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Chill, 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 chill. He was presumptive, but he still has a right to speak. Mr. Burgess Owens is recognized. Mr. Owens. Every witness and everybody here should be treated with respect, and please do so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to all of you for your time and your heartfelt sentiments, and we know they're sincere. Mr. Hughes, I want to thank you for your honesty and your humility and your courage, sir. I know this isn't easy today. Here's a big question that hangs over all this and that all of us need to, I guess, address. Look, many people believe, on all sides of the political spectrum, that racial inequality that we see today is not entirely attributable to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. It's a factor, but it's not entirely attributable. Can you elaborate on what some of the other causative factors may be?
Well, the first thing I would say is that blaming slavery and Jim Crow for the entirety of racial disparity, obviously it's clearly a factor, but blaming it for the entirety of the problems we see today facing black people is actually a way of not taking responsibility for policy decisions that were made just in the last 50 years. Our prisons did not balloon until the 1980s. Unemployment for black and white youths were virtually identical until the late 1950s and early 1960s. So perversely, by blaming slavery and Jim Crow for everything, we actually fail to take responsibility for policy decisions that were made on both sides of the aisle in very recent history. Secondly, I would say that there is a naive assumption that wherever there is a statistical gap in outcomes between two groups, that gap must be attributable to some kind of discrimination, whether that's overt or whether that's structural and systemic. That assumption is not true. Okay, I'll give one example, but I could give dozens. According to 2015 census figures, there's a 21 cent on the dollar gap. It's 21 cents on the dollar gap in household income between white Americans of Russian descent and white Americans of French descent, right? Disparity is the norm, not the exception. So the question is not why two groups would have different outcomes, whether it's for wealth, income, or incarceration. The question is why we would expect any two groups with different histories, different geographical patterns, different patterns of migration, different cultures, to nevertheless get exactly the same outcomes.
Thank you for that. Mr. Owens, thank you as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Coates, I followed your career with interest. Mr. Glover, I'm a big fan, and I want to thank the witnesses for their remarks. Mr. Hughes, I wanted to ask if there was anything that was said previously that you'd like to respond to.
I'd like to address myself to the comments made on the subject of us not knowing our history, of us not having told the truth about slavery and Jim Crow. It strikes me that this is not exactly true. Mr. Glover mentioned all of the studies and books that have been written on the subject. I would argue, in fact, that in the 10,000-year history of slavery on every continent, there is not a single example of slavery that has been more studied than slavery in America from the 17th century to the 19th century. So it is actually not true that we have not told the truth, that we don't know our history. Moreover, in the past 50 years, if we're talking about what scholars in America, in the American social sciences, have directed their attention towards, it is hard to find a subject on which more books have been written that has been more studied than racial inequality. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Mr.
I thank my colleague. I wanted to pitch it back to Mr. Hughes for a moment. In spite of your relative young age, you've had some valuable experience publicly discussing sensitive issues of race and culture. And I just wonder what advice you would give to young people who are thinking about this. As Mr. Owen said, everybody ought to let that marinate a little bit. As they begin to think about it, it's been suggested this morning that ignorance of our history is a big part of this, that everybody across the country, I mean, in large numbers, we suffer from that. What's the response, and what advice do you give to young people?
Well, I would urge people to observe the distinction between understanding history and responding to history. You can understand history, and it can still be the case that you have a range of possible responses in front of you. So addressing myself to Mr. Coates' comments before, if I understand them, the idea is if we really understood our history, then we wouldn't keep Confederate statues up, for example. Therefore, the fact that they're still up implies that we don't really understand it in our bones. And that I think, highlights a distinction between how I think about this issue and how other people on the panel think about it. For example, there was a poll in the Washington Post last year which found that 30% of black Virginians wanted the Confederate statues to stay up. Now, I don't think they wanted that because they hated themselves. I don't think they wanted that because they didn't understand their own history. Perhaps they were people who just didn't like seeing their communities change. There are many people like that, and I respect that, even though I myself would be fine to see those statues come down. So the point here is that our response, whether or not you agree with it, is not itself evidence that we don't understand our history. And we can have two separate conversations. One is what happened in this country, what was done to black people, what harm was incurred. And the second conversation is what do we do about that? And that second conversation the answer to that second conversation is not self-evident from the answer to the first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. I got 15 seconds. Let me give me one more question. You can answer it, I hope. You wrote an article a while back entitled Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap, and you talked about, specifically, the city of Boston, and there was a disparity within the black community, and you've pointed out that black Bostonians of American ancestry had a median household wealth of $8 in that, but Caribbean ancestry had $12,000 of wealth. It talks to the disparity. I just wonder if you'd comment on the implications of that.
Well, this just goes back to the point I made before about disparities even within races being normal. So if you look at census figures for white Americans and break it down, instead of talking about quote-unquote white people, into white people of French ancestry, Russian ancestry, Swedish ancestry, you will find all kinds of disparities that by definition cannot be caused by some kind of systemic discrimination. Likewise, with quote-unquote black Americans, it's a very diverse group. Something like 10% of black people in this country are immigrants from places like Jamaica, Haiti, Nigeria, Ghana. And if you look at each individual group, you will find various disparities in wealth, in income, in crime rates that by definition can't be explained by either race or racism. So my point in citing that disparity is to upset the notion that if society were fair, evidence of that would be equal outcomes between all groups, because there are so many differences historically in groups themselves, geographically, just in terms of median age, right? The average black person in this country is 10 years younger than the average white person. So when you're comparing blacks to whites, that's just one of the many ways in which you're not actually comparing apples to apples. So my point in citing that was just to upset that lazy assumption that we make about socioeconomic and other outcomes.
Thank you. I yield back.